this course was a controlled environment, and high tunnels, everything, especially at this kind of elevation. So we're fortunate to have Miles Lewis here. He's got a lot of experience as well. He's started at your Arizona Vegetable Company. You've had for how many years now?
10.
About 10, yeah. So he's gone to an awful lot of farmers market, done a lot of this, done like the application for the microloan and all, but went through a lot of things like this. So and he's also working on his PhD down at the University of Arizona in the controlled environmental agriculture. So he's doing some things with strawberries down there and high value crops. And he's grown Vib lettuce exclusively almost in hydroponics, right, for quite a while. So he's got a lot of experience on the ground as well as kind of an academic background. So having him present today on controlled environmental agriculture here, kind of considering our higher elevation here, as well as taking into account taking some of this product directly to the marketplace. So that, Miles, I'll give you the driver here, and I guess if you don't mind, mine's probably excellent.
No judgment. No judgment. First, let me get my prop. My pathetic props here. Thank you for the opportunity. My name is Miles Lewis. As Russ said, I'm from Tucson. I'm not from Tucson, but I work in Tucson. So if you need to find me, I'm down at the University of Arizona in Tucson. So feel free to come find me at any point. If you can't get a hold of me, tell the boss here, he'll come find me because that's one of my advisors. So I'm almost beholden to him. So let's get going here. This is going to be a pretty technical talk. I'm going to talk a little bit fast. My expectation is that you guys are going to go home and reread some of these slides. Some of them are meant to really be digested a little bit later on. And I really kind of want to take a shotgun approach and show you guys the things that you really need to consider before you get into controlled environment agriculture. Whenever I talk about CEA, controlled environment agriculture, or hydroponics or greenhouses, there's usually one word that people associate with that: marijuana, right? So I want you to stop thinking about marijuana for just 5 minutes, for 50 minutes, and think about vegetables and fruits and transplants and other crops, because as you might have noticed, cannabis is kind of going down in value over time. It's a little bit cheaper than what it was. So we think that trend will continue. So tomatoes will come back into production. So first, let's get some terminology out of the way. CEA, controlled environment agriculture. That's basically a fancy way of saying protected agriculture in some sort of structure, such as a greenhouse. There's also vertical farms, but that's not really applicable towards this crowd. That's more like New York City, Los Angeles type stuff. We're still able to build in greenhouses. Hydroponics is crop production using a mineral-rich nutrient solution, something like a Miracle-Gro, using a substrate or not a substrate to grow the plants. Aquaculture is going to be the production of fish only, right? So you want to grow tilapia or salmon or trout or something like that. That is specifically called aquaculture. And then aquaponics is going to be the combination of fish culture plus hydroponics doing some sort of plant. So you're using fish effluent and fish waste to actually grow your plants and fertilize them. Where do I find a greenhouse, Miles? Well, my official University of Arizona answer is go to the NGMA, which is the National Greenhouse Manufacturers Association. So that's the list of all the greenhouse manufacturers within America that are all reputable manufacturers that make high quality greenhouses. You will find other manufacturers out there, but this would be the first place I would go. Absent of that, the unofficial answer is you go on the internet and there's places like Greenhouse Megastore and other websites, Farm Tech, Agritech, and they all sell greenhouse type kits. And you can of course call the manufacturer directly and try to buy from them. What type of greenhouse do I need is a common question. Well, what are you going to grow? How much money do you have? What's your purpose? Are you going to be growing tomatoes? Tomatoes generally require a taller greenhouse. For those of you who live up here, you're familiar with the snowflake operation. That is a very tall greenhouse operated by Copper State. Other crops like lettuces and herbs and transplants, you can get away with a smaller style greenhouse because you don't need that vertical distance. Where are you going to be growing? Well, we're in Snowflake and northern Arizona, so it's going to be a different climate than what I'm used to down in Tucson. It's going to be a lot colder. It's going to have a shorter warm season up here. So that just means you have to accommodate for it a little bit more. How are you going to grow? The type of system that you choose is also going to dictate the style of greenhouse that you ultimately choose. And it can get very, very fancy, or it can be a fairly low-tech operation. You need to think about the volume that you're going to grow. Are you trying to satisfy a farmer's market, or are you trying to sell to Cisco and Safeway and people like that? That's going to change the volume which you're trying to produce. And of course, what's your budget allow you to purchase? And can you use all that? For example, if I'm driving along Main Street out here and I have a Ferrari, I'm not driving it very fast. I'm limited at 25 miles an hour. And so you need to think about that. I don't want to go buy a $10 million greenhouse, but I'm only growing something that's a low value iceberg lettuce or something like that. Or I don't know how to operate it. The first thing you should do when considering this, if you just bought a piece of land or you're thinking about building a greenhouse, is do the site survey. And you're going to be looking at all these different things. Where is the sun? How long does it shine? Are there shadows? Where's the local market? Do I have access to my materials? How much does it rain or snow? How cold does it get outside overnight when we leave our plants in the car to demonstrate to people? The proximity to where you're trying to sell. Are you 3 or 4 hours away from your customers and you have to sit there and really think about how you're going to transport your product, or are you right around the corner from them? The other ones that we don't really like to talk about, of course, but affect you are the taxes, the zoning, and any sort of political issues that might arise. These can either play in your benefit if you're really good at politicking, or it can play against you if you're not so good at it and you happen to be in a place like Los Angeles where they just sit there and really try to zone the crap out of you. But now, nope, stopped. Technical difficulties, please hang on. There we go. Thank you. I'm not the computer guy. I'm the plant guy. So anyway, when you're talking about greenhouses and these types of protected structures, there's many different ways to classify them. So let's run through that really quickly. Easiest way to think about it is low tech, medium tech, and high tech. If you're on a budget or you don't want to invest a lot, you're looking at lower tech greenhouses. These are going to be wood, plastic, or metal type, frames. I would encourage you to think about metal frames. Wood and water usually don't mix and you start getting rots and things like that unless you're using marine grade woods or pressure treated woods. But in general, they'll fail over time. So I would try to use metal as much as you possibly can. But if you can't, pressure treated wood is the way to go. You want pressure treated. You could be growing in the soil, in the ground. You could be doing it hydroponically. It could just be a high tunnel, something like what the NRCS offers you guys. In general, they could have sidewalls, but they might not. So this picture right here is out of Florida. In Florida, we know what the weather's like over there, so they don't necessarily need to have heating or cooling the same way we do. But this is an example of a low-tech greenhouse. There's not very much to it. There's a plastic roof, there's some sidewall, or excuse me, some end walls, and then maybe a fan or two somewhere in there to circulate the air. These are typically relatively cheap, going for $25 to $35 per meter squared, which translates to about $2 to $5 per square foot. And now that we're in pandemic mode and everything's going up, it's probably closer to $5 to $10 per square foot. And these are things you can build yourself or you can buy the kit. Next is medium tech. That's definitely going to be a metal type structure. That's probably somewhere where most of us are going to be playing. This is going to be a kit that you buy off the internet where they just send you a barrel full of parts and then you construct it yourself with your buddies over a weekend or your favorite contractor. Generally, they're going to have a polyethylene, which is PE, or some sort of rigid glazing, which is going to be a hard plastic, which lasts a long time. It can have active or passive cooling, meaning it can have sidewalls that open or close, or I might have fans or heaters in there that actually control the place like an HVAC system. In terms of controlling it, it's going to be relatively basic. It's probably just going to be a thermostat like what we remember in grandma's house, where you turn it one direction for heat, you turn it the other direction for cold, and that's how it's going to work. These will be slightly more expensive depending on all the bells and whistles that you put in there. And again, that's the thing, is that much like a car or a house, there's options. And so the options are really your call and dictated by what your purpose is. High tech, which is not really applicable to most people, I think, in this discussion. High tech would be like the Copper State facility, a very, very high tech facility, typically made out of glass with steel structures, computer control systems that are doing everything from A to Z. These will often cost more than $100 per meter squared. And again, it depends on the options. So I would start on the lower end in a lower or medium tech style greenhouse for the purposes of getting into CEA. There are many types of greenhouses that you can choose. They come in many shapes and sizes. This graphic just shows a few different ways to think about it. The top of the graphic shows gutter connected greenhouses, which are linked together, which allow you to have multiple bays of growth or just one really large area. And you would do things like this as opposed to having individual separated structures for heating and cooling reasons. The thermodynamics of it will be a little bit better. There's many different ways to classify it. So you hear about Quonsets, hoops, and high tunnels. Those are all effectively the same style of greenhouse. There's going to be different shapes of the roofs, which is the arched, the ridges. If you've ever heard someone try to advertise an inflatable greenhouse, run, go the other direction. You do not want an inflatable greenhouse. And I can give you one-word answers for why you don't want to do that. Cactus, mesquite, thorns, salsola, tumbleweeds. There's lots of reasons you don't want an inflatable one. So even though it looks really great in the advertising and you might see someone swinging on it to demonstrate its structure, you don't want that. They don't live in Arizona for whatever reason. There's a lot of equipment that can go inside the greenhouse. Typically, it's going to be grouped in terms of controllers, your HVAC, your growing system. These are all the different things. And so you can have really fancy items like carbon dioxide generators or ozone generators, but really you don't need those necessarily for some of this basic stuff. Shade curtains help a lot here in Arizona, especially during the summertime. Thermal curtains are going to be used, especially during the colder periods, like right now. There's a lot of equipment. Typically, your cooling system here in Arizona is going to be pad and fan, and that's just really a fancy way of saying evaporative cooling or swamp cooler. There's going to be a pad on one end and a couple of fans on the other end, and it's going to drag cool, moist air through your house, or excuse me, through your greenhouse. The caveat is when it gets to be, say, monsoon time, like it is in Tucson, or if you have heavy rains, you know that your cooling efficiency goes way down. The evaporative cooler just stops working, and so you can get very limited cooling. Fortunately, we're at a higher elevation here, so that's kind of okay. But down in Tucson, it means that my maximum cooling might only be 85 degrees or something like that. So I have to compensate in different ways by reducing the light. Controllers, the things that make stuff go on and off, can be classified in a couple different ways. There's going to be analog and digital. Analog being something like the rheostat that I described, where there's really just an on-off button, not really a lot of digital sensors going on in there. Whereas the digital stuff might have an app. Yes.
Okay, so online there was a question about the CO2, and I wanted to kind of stay on target.
Sure.
What's up with the CO2 generator? Isn't CO2 our mortal enemy?
CO2 is not our mortal enemy. You would like CO2 in your greenhouse. As a human being, yes, CO2 is probably a bad thing, but plants do like CO2. You're trying to minimally get at least ambient CO2 outside, which means that you have air exchanges. So if you're hitting 300 to 400 parts per million CO2, that's about what you need to get at minimum. So that just means open the window and get air exchanges. Don't go too high though, because then that's obviously toxic to people. The digital controllers, going back to those, that can be something very fancy, like one of these high-end controllers that costs thousands upon thousands of dollars, such as an Argus system or a Priva system, or it could be something so simple as an Arduino if you happen to be really good at programming and using microcomputers. They have a range of features which can literally control everything, and then they have a lot of feedback because in the case of a lot of the digital controllers, you have complementary sensors that go with that measure air temperature, water temperature, carbon dioxide, light. And so it's giving you information back, or at minimum, it's helping the computer make a decision on your behalf. This is an example of what some of the graphical user interfaces look like. And so if you sit there and say, Miles, I'm not a numbers guy, I need something a little bit more visual, you want to buy a controller that has something like this to where you can sit there and say, hey, red bad, green good, yellow sort of in the middle. Your employees can sit there and understand that, even if you can. And they can report back to you and be like, hey, boss, the thingamajig over here is in the red. You need to go do something about that. So that's an efficient way to sit there and look at some of this stuff, because not everybody can interpret these types of graphs. But colorimetric things help out a lot, especially with some of the employees that aren't, taking ag classes. Your fertigation system, this is going to be the thing that applies fertilizer to the crops. Fertigation is fertilizer plus irrigation, fertigation. And so in general, what you're doing is you're drawing from concentrated stock solutions. So if you think about it, a lot of it's sort of dumbed down. We call it Miracle Grow. It's not totally Miracle Grow, but you're going to make very concentrated versions of that. And then you sit there and distribute it in very small amounts through a drip system or a bubbler system or a fogger or something like that to your crop ultimately. They come in both passive and active. Passive meaning that it's going to be water controlled or air controlled, and it sort of goes regardless of electricity. So when I open the valve and I've got water pressure, it starts pumping and then drawing out. Active systems obviously will require some form of energy. So if your power goes out, you're not getting any irrigation. Again, the higher tech type things are going to sit there and feature some sort of feedback telling you, is the conductivity, is the salt content where you want it to be? How strong is it? Is the pH where I want it to be? Because plants like certain pHs depending on what the plant is. In terms of sensors, think about it this way. There's upstairs and then there's downstairs. Upstairs is the aerial environment. So that's what the plant's experiencing up here, the leaves, the stems, the fruits. The root zone is going to be under the ground. So that's going to be within the substrate. And you're measuring different things and some of the same stuff. So temperature, you want to get both in both scenarios. Airspeed is obviously going to be something that happens in the aerial environment. pH and EC are something that happen in the root zone. So there's going to be a lot of things to monitor over time. Well, what about a greenhouse up here? The good news is you can still do this. Crop production in extremely high elevations, low elevations, non-lighted elevations. We have but we have controlled environments in Antarctica that we support. So if they can do it in Antarctica, I think we can do it up here in northern Arizona. The difference is going to be that you have lighting, temperature, humidity differences. So the light will change up here. It's definitely a lot cooler. The humidity will be different. The air is a little bit thinner. And so these are minor things that will affect your greenhouse. The net effect is it's going to be more expensive for you to grow up here because you have to heat. Heating and cooling are typically very expensive processes in greenhouses next to labor. Transportation is kind of a pain up here, depending on where you're trying to sell into. If you're staying local, awesome. If you're trying to ship it down to Phoenix or to Tucson or to Flagstaff, that could be a little bit more challenging because you guys are sort of isolated up here. And then, of course, one of the more frustrating things is the availability of equipment. I haven't had the opportunity to really drive around to see if you guys have a Home Depot and a Lowe's and an Ace and a Northern Tool. My guess is you probably don't. You probably have 3 out of 4. Perfect. So you got some availability of equipment, but you might not have the fertilizer guy, or you might not have the specialty, sprinkler world or something like that. So sometimes that can actually be the most impeding thing is I can't get the equipment that I need to grow and I have to mail order it. And then that's a shipping cost. In case you try to ship fertilizers, it's very expensive when you do some of them because they're hazardous materials. So hydroponics, it obviously has advantages and disadvantages. The advantages, it saves a lot of water and fertilizer. Nobody cares right now until we start running out of water. Oh, wait, we're starting to do that right now. We are running out of water. And so if you think about it, 90% of the lettuce comes out of Yuma, Salinas, and Imperial Valley that serves the United States. Those seem like desert type areas to me. So the water thing is going to become really important in the next 5 to 10 years. You get higher quality produce at a cost. You generally get higher yields in a shorter period of time at a cost. And the disadvantage is you have to have some expertise to do this. And so that's why I'm here blabbing at you guys today. That's why you're taking all these classes. That's why you hire crop consultants and advisors. There's going to be the capital requirement because generally it's said 10 times the unit, or excuse me, 10 times the production in greenhouses, but it's going to be 10 times the cost per unit area. So it's going to cost you more to get into it, but you're going to have greater yield. So there's an investment that goes into this. Fertilizer shortages, that's something that's starting to happen, but we're not going to talk about that today because that's politics. So now let's get into the types of hydroponic systems. You can classify these things in lots of different ways. So let's do a few of them. Liquid culture and aggregate culture. Liquid culture is going to be the plant suspended in some form of liquid nutrient solution. Think about floating lettuce. If you've ever seen lettuce floating on rafts or in beds, that's a type of liquid culture. Aeroponics, if you've ever seen something like that. Aggregate culture is the plant's going to be growing in some sort of medium or substrate. And that's going to be typical of like what you would see at Copper State or what used to be Eurofresh, which is now Nature Sweet, because I'm growing something in a pot or I'm growing it in rock wool or a slab or a trough or something like that. There's media in there for me to grow into. In both cases, a mineral-rich nutrient solution is being applied to the crop. Open or closed. An open system means that I'm going to apply my fertilizer once, and then it goes out to wherever its next destination is, which is usually the sewer. But if you're really smart about it, what you're going to do is you're going to recycle that output solution because it passes through very, very quickly. You still have a lot of the nutrients left. You could water your friend, the tree outside, your grass, a secondary crop. So you still have some use of this if you want it. Otherwise, you need to dispose of it. And that could be a political thing depending on what your local sewer water company is doing for you. Closed means that you're going to recirculate it. Recirculation means that you have to bump back up the nutrition because you just used some of it up. You might also have to do some filtration because some crud gets in the water, your substrate, your soil. And then there might also be some nasties in the water like diseases or bugs, stuff like that. And so you want to sit there and filter it out either through UV, mechanical, chemical methods to treat them. Passive and active, again, that shows up in this case too. A passive system could be something where it's, well, it's set it and forget it. It's the Ron Popeil of crop production systems. A wick system, the floating system, air gaps, deep flow hydroponics, which is DFHS. Those are all passive systems, but they can be active. Active means that I added some form of power to it. So I'm adding a water pump or an air pump or some sort of controller to it. NFT, aeroponics, aquaponics, aquaculture, things that have living organisms in them, those generally require a lot more inputs. That's good. Yeah, there we go. There's some formal types of hydroponic systems. So if you try to communicate with someone like me at the U of A or someone else, these are the names you need to use with us. There's all sorts of new terms coming out: duckaponics, fishaponics, bubbleponics. Everyone likes to have their own term that they made up, but generally these are the ones that you're going to sit there seeing a permutation of in someone's greenhouse. She jumped the gun. NFT, nutrient film technique. And so this is a constant stream of water running through. And so you can imagine that this is an active system because I have to have a pump moving my water, right? Generally, this is going to be one of those ones where you don't have substrate or you're just going to have a small cube holding your plants in place. You don't need a lot of soil because, again, the roots are in contact with the water. Lightweight, space efficient. It's pretty simple. I can build it out of gutters from Home Depot or Lowe's or your favorite hardware store. You have limited spans of 10 to 20 feet. You're not going to see these 100 or 200 foot runs of NFT channels. Urban farms, rooftop gardens, that's where you would kind of see this stuff. I don't want to put a swimming pool worth of water on the top of a roof in LA because it's going to sink in. I want something very lightweight. This is an example of a very simple schematic of what an NFT system looks like. And so you can see there's a bucket here containing the water or the nutrient solution with a pump that's going to be moving the solution back up to the top of the NFT channel. I've got drip lines that go into each plant or at minimum at the very top of it running down the slope, and then it just recirculates. And so you can see that is literally a rain gutter. And I've made these out of rain gutters. I've made them out of PVC pipes. So there's a lot of ways to MacGyver these types of things instead of buying the dedicated system, which costs you $20,000 for a small one. This is a real live example of a commercial system. So this one's offered by a company out of California, and they're growing lettuce in this case. You can see the lettuce growing in a small cube. The cube is the only substrate present in this case. You see the drip line feeding into it. The water then flows down towards the end of it. It's very, very efficient. I've got very minimal water loss because the only place for the water to go is through the plant, right? That's evapotranspiration. That's the only place it can go. It's not like in a field where it can be runoff, infiltration, evaporation, evapotranspiration, captured within the plant. There's lots of places for the water to go outside. Here, we're trying to minimize it. Ebb and flood, that's exactly what it sounds like. It's going to be like the ocean. So water comes in, water comes out. We call them flood tables for short. Typically run on some sort of timer, which could be sensor-based, or it could just be a very simple mechanical timer. Generally, this is going to require power for the water pump. We knew that. The exposed surfaces on the downside tend to accumulate algae. And so there's going to be some sort of maintenance required when you're working with your flood tables. When you have water plus fertilizer plus light, you will get algae. If you take a deep breath right now, you are sucking in spores of algae and bacteria and things like that. And the only reason it's not forming any green stuff is because there's no light in your lungs. But just know that the spores are everywhere and we can't see them. This is a great method for sub-irrigation, which is a preferred way to grow stuff because we try to avoid having water on top of the plant. That generally sponsors fungal responses. We don't like that. I use it a lot for transplant production and for seedling production. It's a very effective way to grow my small little starts. This is an example of a medium tech greenhouse. This is a kit that you can buy from a company called Nexus. This is about 1,000 square foot greenhouse. And these tables on the left here were, I think they were custom made, but you can buy flood tables almost anywhere. You can make them with liners and stuff like that. But that's what you see. So a whole bunch of trays growing plants for approximately 2 to 3 weeks. In the very back of the photo, you see some blue injectors, an injector board, and some barrels. That's my fertilizer injector system. This happens to be a more passive one that works off water. And if you ever show up at the U of A, these are all things we can show you. Bag culture, this is what used to happen over at Copper State when it was growing tomatoes. They would sit there and take 3-foot long bags of rock wool, put a few tomato plants in them, and then that bag would contain all the roots for the entire plant over the course of about a 9-month growing period. So it's very effective, lightweight, cheap. In this case, you need something called a lysimeter. And what that does is it collects the drainage. So you want to collect all the water running out so you can sort of test it and make sure it's doing what you think it's going to be doing. Deep flow, that's basically a pool. And the pool can be as little as 4 to 6 inches, or it could be 10 feet deep if you really want. I would recommend smaller volumes to start off with, but the minimum that you need is 4 to 6 inches of water. And what that does is it provides a buffer capacity. So if the power goes out or something like that, you still have water going to your crops and it's still floating. You're on vacation, you get the call, the power went out. Yeah, call me in 2 weeks when I get back. There's still water in the tank, right? Yeah, okay, cool. The lettuce is still going to keep growing, okay? The downside is it's difficult to maintain your nutrients and the aeration. And the reason is I have such a large volume of water, I'm diluting all my nutrients down. So I have to add more and more to it. So if you're trying to make 100 gallons of soup versus a can of soup, you can imagine the differences when you're trying to salt or pepper it to get it to flavor. Typically, the components are going to be a pond, which you can build or buy, styrofoam, which you use to float on top. Do not use the pink stuff or the blue stuff from Home Depot. Do not use that. I got a very nasty letter from the manufacturer saying, do not do that. It's not intended for that purpose. There's specific styrofoams manufactured from companies like Beaver Plastics. And that's the only one I can think of off the top of my head. I'm not specifically advertising them. But there's specific styrofoams meant for that type of hydroponic production. You need an aerator to provide dissolved oxygen to the solution because that will deplete over time. And then a circulation pump. In my case, I need a chiller in Tucson because the water gets very warm and that creates problems with oxygen. And of course, you need nutrient solution. If you were to go find the big players in lettuce production, this is how all of them are doing this. All the major operations do floating hydroponic systems. Kind of interesting. This is a very dumbed down example of it, but you can see I have a reservoir here containing nutrient solution. I've got my styrofoam board and then some bib lettuce growing on the top. In this case, this was a passive hydroponic system, Ron Popeil system. Set it and forget it, right? And so that's what happened here. I let the plants float for 4 to 6 weeks. I do not touch it at any point in between when I stick the plant in and when I pull the plant out. And that's got some food safety labor implications to it, right? I didn't touch it, so that's my nasty, gross hands didn't get into your produce. And I saved myself a few bucks by not having to pay my guys or girls. This is a larger version of it. Again, this is something you can make yourself with pond liners and pressure treated wood or steel or something like that. Same concept. This is what my greenhouse used to look like that Russ was referring to, that Dr. Tronstad was referring to. We've got a whole bunch of different things growing on all in the same location. I've got transplant production, I've got lettuce production, I've got microgreen production, I've got baby green production. There's some flowers somewhere up in there. These are all floating hydroponic beds. Okay. There's a lot of different ways to start your plants. Yes.
Sorry, question. Previously, is this the crack system?
Yes. Someone always gets it. This is the Kratky system. I would love to take credit for this. In fact, Dr. Kratky would probably love to take credit for this, but this type of growing system has existed for thousands of years. If you think about the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, that was an example of a floating hydroponic system. Dr. Kratky at a University of Hawaii happened to be one of the current people who sat there and really popularized this. So thank you, Dr. Kratky, wherever you are. Back to starting your plants, there's several different ways to do that. For everyone in this conversation, I believe seeds are going to be the way you're going to do it. You might take some cuttings of a specific plant if you really want to replicate that plant, but generally seeds are the way to go at this point. Plants that you produce could either be used internally, you could put them outside and you're just getting a jump on the season. That could be the product that you're selling to somebody else. You're going to sell them to the rest of the people in the room. When we have healthy plants, that ensures crop success or helps to ensure future crop success. If I have a very cruddy looking plant that's not very healthy, I'm probably not going to have a very healthy plant growing up. It's going to take a lot of energy for that plant to grow out of it. And when I say healthy, what that means is a strong plant. It's got uniformity to it. It's got strong root system. It's turgid and upright. There's no pests, there's no disease, there's no viruses. There's some common materials used within crop production in greenhouses. Most common are perlite, vermiculite, rock wool, coconut coir. You can use sand, gravel. There's some newer products coming out, but these are typically the ones that you would see outside that are available at your hobby stores or for purchase. There's some considerations for each of them, which you can see in the bullet points. When you really get into picking one, for example, perlite's the worst out of them. You really want to wear a dust mask when you're handling perlite, or make sure you wet it down because it could be noxious to your lungs. It's very dusty. So just, there's some safety things you need to do, but most of these are pretty nice. The key thing is that inert, 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 inert. And what that means is that there's nothing there. And so I'm in control of 100% of what goes into that plant, as opposed to the soil where I have no idea what's in the ground. There could be lots of nitrogen, there could be not a lot of nitrogen, and I can have a completely different soil profile over here and over here and over here. And I haven't really moved more than a couple feet, but if you did a soil test, you will find differences. This is nice because, again, you are in control of everything. And so that's what we like to see in hydroponics. I want control of the environment, the plant, the system, the nutrients, everything. Typically, you're going to be growing in propagation trays. You can get styrofoam ones. They have different types of plastic ones. There's several different manufacturers that I list here that all make different styles. They come in every shape, size, orifice, thickness that you can possibly think of. So just go on the internet and sit there and search around. Oftentimes you can see an example at your local stores. This is an example of some really nice plants that I grew. I've grown some very not nice plants before in my life too, but this happened to be a very nice set of uniform plants. They have the same number of leaves. They're all the same height. They all came up at the same time. That's partly because I'm a really good grower, but a lot of it's due to the substrate that I used. I used good quality seed, and I provided the right conditions. I'd like to give myself credit, but it's really the plant is doing most of the work over here. So that's what you're looking for in crop production when you're starting your plants off. You want something very nice and uniform. That can be achieved in this system very, very easily. So this came from this. Okay. This is an example of pepper transplants coming out of California. So it doesn't have to be limited to lettuces and things like that. You might do peppers, tomatoes, you could even do cannabis, melons, grasses, whatever you like. Any of the crops that you see here, those can probably be propagated as a transplant if you wish. Nutrients, that's the fertilizers. They're going to be classified as macro and micro. Things needed in large amounts, that's the macronutrients. Things needed in small amounts, which are the micronutrients. Large ones are going to be your NPKs, magnesium, calcium, stuff like that. The micros are going to be boron and copper and the other heavy metals that are out there. You'll hear about other nutrients that could be important, like cobalt and silicon. Don't worry about those just yet. You need to focus on the macros and the micros that are typically found in any Miracle Grow or Peter's Professional Bag or, potassium nitrate, stuff like that. Your fertilizers can be organic or inorganic. Organic is going to be something that's naturally derived. I personally think organic is sort of this nebulous political term, which, depending on who you ask, has a different definition. So I wouldn't heavily focus on organic. Plant and animal byproducts, so bone meal, blood meal, cow manure, sheep manure, chicken manure, pig manure, all the manures that you can possibly think of. These are organic products. These are not things that we typically want to be using inside the greenhouse. And mainly that's because of inconsistencies. So if my cow's diet changes over time, or I have two different cows supplying the manure to me, they could have vastly different, we'll call it output. We don't want that. Again, we're control freaks. So we want to know exactly how much nitrogen is going in, and it needs to be consistent every time so that I can sit there and plan my crop out. If I'm using inconsistent stuff like these, it could go all over the place. You'll also hear about things like these seaweed extracts and eye of newt and, all these kind of weird, new products. Quick and dirty is the synthetic organic. And when you say synthetic, it's got this kind of, nasty way of thinking about it. But a lot of them are, just think of the powdered fertilizers that you would buy at, say, Crop Production Services or Nutrien or one of those types of companies. Magnesium sulfate, which happens to be Epsom salt. So if you're soaking your feet, you're using the same product that I'm sticking there in my tomatoes. Potassium nitrate, who eats beef jerky? Okay, well, that's in the beef jerky too. So a lot of these things are commonly being used, and you may or may not realize it. So don't think too much about synthetic being really bad. A lot of them are, byproducts of some process. The Haber-Bosch process is the most famous one for nitrogen. Just an interesting aside, most of this came from wartime efforts in the early 1900s. So when they figured out how to build bombs and things like that, they were all nitrogenous-based bombs. And so that's where a lot of our fertilizer content came from. So just kind of an interesting aside. Again, the nutrient solutions provide everything that the plant needs because there's nothing in the substrate. Remember, it's inert, so I have to give it everything that it needs. The recipe is going to be geared towards the stage of growth. And so it sounds absolutely insane, but if you can personify the plant, you'll have an easier time growing it. And the example I can give you is, if I'm a baby, I need baby food. If I'm a teenager or whatever age I am, I need like steak and eggs. If I'm like 95 years old, I probably need Ensure or something like that. And so my dietary requirements change over time. Sometimes that's a bad example, but it gets the point home, is that you have to think about the stage of life that your plant is growing in. It can be prepared in a concentrated form, so I can make it ahead of time and then use it as I need it, or I can sit there and just make it up each week as I really feel like it. It's going to be mixed with water, so your water quality is very important. And then you may or may not have to acidify or raise the pH, and that's all your water quality dependent. I can't tell you what you're going to have to do. So you need to know what's going on. You need to test. And so that's going to be a water test, at least minimum one time per year, unless you got some kind of funky well, or you're living in like Flint, Michigan, or something like that. You want to sit there and do a test. It's going to cost you about $50 to $75 to get a complete analysis, but it's going to tell you everything that's in your water. And that's a really good thing to know. At minimum 1 time per year, please. Because again, your water quality will change. Ours does in Tucson on an annual basis. There's a lot of numbers on this slide. The important thing to note is that it's a range. So when someone sits there and says, oh, how much nitrogen do I need in my lettuce? Well, if you ask someone at the USDA, they're going to say, oh yeah, it's between 1 and 200 parts per million. Well, that's a pretty large range for me to choose from, but at least it's a range that we know of. So this is some ranges that you would play in typically within a hydroponic lettuce solution. And this is lots of different lettuces. This isn't just bib lettuce. This could be romaine lettuce. This could be leaf lettuce. I wouldn't recommend growing iceberg lettuce. You know, that's just such cheap, low value crop. But just keep in mind, there's some ranges to go in. This is the solution that I use. So if you said, Miles, I need a recipe today, here you go. Go ahead and make it. My compliments. If you can decipher that, good. That's probably why you need this class. I think you got this on the slide, so you don't have to take a picture. But anyway, that's one recipe. So that's like a $1,000 piece of information right there. This is what people pay me to sit there and show them. This is one for tomatoes. We use it in tomatoes, cucumbers, peppers. I can use it on lettuce. I can use it on basil. So again, in this case, what you see versus this one, this is single stage. I'm growing lettuce, a very quick 30-day crop that doesn't fruit. I have no fruits. It's a lettuce. In this case, I've got 3 recipes, recipe 1, 2, and 3, and this is geared towards, again, the stages of growth. Get my plant up, get some fruit production going, maintain the fruit production and the high quality. So that's what you see here. Because it says tomato doesn't mean that you can't use it for other stuff. Can I put Miracle Grow on a variety of different plants? Absolutely. Same thing applies here. So again, another $1,000 piece of information free from the government for you guys. It's important to remember that the plants can be affected by many things in the environment. The temperature, which again, remember, upstairs and downstairs, both of them are going to affect your plant growth. Relative humidity, light intensity, how much light, how long it's getting light, the quality of the light. Is it blue? Is it red? Is it sunlight? Is it a little light bulb? The nutrition that you provide for it. The carbon dioxide, is it ambient, which is the minimum that you need, or are you amplifying it? And of course, you got to worry about pests and disease. And if you're a little hippy dippy, then you're worrying about the bad vibes. I know, right? Sorry. Agri-comedy. It's agri-comedy up here. You want to focus on the things that can affect your plants. And so thinking about disease susceptibility, if it's really cold and rainy and I'm standing outside, there's a higher probability that I'm going to get sick. The same thing's going to happen to the plant. The plant is going to be susceptible to cruddy conditions. And so you need to think about that. The pest pressure, there could be certain times of year that affect how the pest reacts with the plant. It's going to be either really favorable or it's too cold for the aphids or something like that. If it's too cold in my greenhouse, well, that can affect how quick my crop comes, because again, the metabolism is affected by temperature. If you think about it, this morning, it's pretty friggin' cold. And so I'm sitting there moving a little bit slower until I get some coffee and hash browns in me. If this was the middle of July, 8 a.m., I'm moving around, everything's fine, my metabolism's going, but when it's cold and frigid, or if it's too hot, you know, so there is something to be said for the metabolism and how it's affected by all these different things. And of course, the texture and taste can be affected by this stuff as well, which is a tool for you. You can manipulate texture and taste within your plant. I can make it saltier, I can make it sweeter, I can make it firmer, smaller, bigger. So when you get to be a more advanced grower, you have more control in these types of systems than you would say in the field. These are just some general set points. Gee, Miles, I got my greenhouse. What am I supposed to set the thermostat at? How long is it going to take me? Well, here's a table for your reference to sit there and think about that. It's broken up into 2 stages, my transplant stage, the first couple of weeks of life, and then the grow out, which is going to be the balance of it. And again, lettuces are a pretty short one. I can get a lettuce crop out in between 3 to 8 weeks, depending on the type of lettuce I'm growing and how big I want it to get. I'm looking at EC, so that's how concentrated my fertilizer solution is. I'm looking at pH, that's the acidity, my air temperature, my solution temperature. If I've got my plants sitting in a floating bed of water that's 10 degrees, they're probably pretty cold. 10 degrees C. Relative humidity, if it's too hot, or excuse me, if it's too humid, the plant can't transpire. It's like sitting in Georgia or Alabama in the middle of the summer. You're just like, wow, I'm sweating, but I'm not getting cooler. What's going on? PAR, photosynthetically active radiation. So that's basically saying the sunlight, how much of the sunlight's coming in. The photo period, that's how long the plant is exposed to the light. That's in terms of hours. Generally, more hours is better, and we like that. Up here during the wintertime, you might have to throw on some extra light bulbs to achieve a photo period. You hear about the cannabis growers doing this all the time, where they have to turn on lights or turn off lights. That can apply to things like strawberries if you're doing short day plants, and lettuce if you don't get enough. Break into strawberries. There seemed to be interest in strawberries. Everyone's kind of sick of lettuce. If you're scared, if you're nervous, lettuce is a very easy crop to start off on. It's high value, lower risk, quick to return. If you screw up, you can sit there and replant it very, very quickly. You have tons of different options, and it's not so finicky as a strawberry. But once you've mastered the lettuce, then you want to move on to something else like, say, tomatoes or strawberries or peppers or cucumbers. We're going to start talking about that. Strawberries, they are photoperiodic plants, which means that they're sensitive to day length. So they pay attention to how long the light is shining on them and the quality that comes in. And you basically have two different types. You have short day plants, which flower and fruit under shorter day lengths. So when it gets, more towards winter conditions. And then you have things that are day neutral or everbearing, where they just say, hey, screw it, I'm going to grow under any conditions you give me. The better the condition, the better I'll grow. But I can sit there and operate within a pretty wide range, and the daylight is not as doesn't affect me as much. There are considerations for both of these. In the case of the everbearing ones, it's important to remember that if it gets too hot or too cold, the flower goes, hey, you know what? I'm going to shut down for a while until the conditions are more appropriate. And again, if you can personify it or think about it like an animal, this is a reproductive phase, the strawberry. The strawberry is the reproductive structure of the plant. And so, not all animals are in heat throughout the year. Some humans are. But when the conditions aren't right, things don't happen. Well, the same thing is going to happen within the plants. Typically with strawberries, it's going to be a bare root plant, sort of like a rose bush that's sent to you or dug up out of a field. And then that's the product that you're actually going to receive and then plant. The term frigo means that it was sitting in a refrigerator or a freezer. And that's something where it can be stored longer term over time. And that's typically what's sent to you. Again, you're going to be measuring lots of different stuff when you get into crop production. You're going to be looking at stuff within the plant, within the aerial environment, within the root zone, within your business, right? And so you're going to do sort of horticultural stuff like counting flowers and runners, the vegetative part. And that helps you gauge whether the plant is in the stage you want it to be in, or if it's not in the stage you want it to be in. And there's ratios and things that we can describe to you in the future. This is what a bare root plant looks like. So on the left is the picture of the plant as I received it in the mail. It had a whole bunch of sand and crud on it that I had to rinse off. So that was stage one, is receive the plants, wash them off from the nursery. The picture on the right is what they were transplanted into. I've got an example up here, which I'll pass around. But this plant here, this is typically what you order, and that's what you're going to receive. In general, for strawberries, this is the protocol you would follow once receiving the plants. So you're going to receive them. You're going to sterilize everything. You want clean stuff to start off with. You're not going to cook with dirty dishes or, dirty pots and pans. The same thing here. I'm going to prepare my substrate, wash the plant, and go put it in there, put it on my irrigation system, things of that nature. This is what it looks like after I've grown the strawberries out for a couple months. In some cases, I can direct plant, so like direct seeding into a field. That's going to be longer time to establishment. Some of them are going to die here and there. I'm not going to have complete uniformity. Or I can start with a transplant to ensure that I get to sit there and really cherry pick the plants that I want and stick them into my system. So the plants that are really compact and cruddy looking, those can go the way of the dodo. I want the really good ones to go into my system. The final transplant, again, I'm cherry picking. I want the best stuff to go in there because that ensures the highest amount of success and the highest amount of uniformity. My customers will be sensitive to me and my production if I have varying quality and volume coming out over time. So this is one way to help ensure that. The planting density, I'm putting 8 to 10 plants of whatever variety every 3 feet. So that means for a 3-foot section, I've got 8 to 10 plants within that prop or bag or area or however you'd like to describe it. In this case, I'm putting 1 2-liter per hour, which is about half a gallon per minute or half a gallon per hour per plant. And so that's 1 dripper per plant. And I can always increase it, but I need at least 1 in general. You can probably get away with half as much if you're really on a budget, but having 1 dripper per plant is usually the way we recommend it to folks. This is what it looks like when I'm going to plant. So I've got my beautiful transplants that I've cherry picked. I'm going to stick them in my 1 meter trough, 3 feet. I'm going to have it in a staggered orientation here to allow for the roots to get out. Okay. And then it grows out in the greenhouse. I'm going to start off with tap water for a couple days just to get the plants acclimated. And then I'm going to start with some fertilizer solution. Hopefully your tap water has low salt in it. You're going to add all the salt later on. Irrigation is typically on for 1 to 3 minutes, very, very short periods of time. So it's, very small blasts of water. So it's drip irrigation. It's really tactical. In our case, we were watering 3 times a day, sometimes 4 times per day if it got really, really warm. But this was all time-based. So it'd click on for 1 minute every few hours, collect the drainage. The drainage is what you're measuring to make sure I got enough water. If I'm adding water and nothing's coming out, the plant is still thirsty. So I want to add water and fertilizer until I see stuff coming out the bottom and running off. And there's ways to think about that. These are some target set points for your greenhouse. So when you get the greenhouse, you need to set the thermostat in the daytime and the nighttime to different temperatures. They like to have a difference, which helps with flower initiation. If it's always the same temperature, there's not as much impetus for the plant to sit there and go, oh, it's getting towards winter, I need to reproduce. So nighttime temperatures are pretty important. You can obviously go too low, like what I did last night, leaving the flower in the car. In some cases, if we have really low humidity, like we do here in Arizona, I need to add humidity, and that can be achieved through foggers or misting systems. Again, what we're trying to do is, where do strawberries come from? California. And so we're trying to replicate some of those nice coastal conditions. And so if you can imagine at night, the humidity rolls in and it's kind of cool. That's what we're attempting to regulate here. Regisol, that's just a way, that's a whitewash paint. So in Tucson, it gets just bloody hot. And so sometimes the only way to cool off is to remove sunlight. So we whitewash our greenhouses for 2 to 4 months out of the year. This is what my strawberry greenhouse looked like when I set it up. This was approximately 1,000 square feet. You can see that there's 4 rows. There's probably room for a 5th row in there, but I need to walk around. That is up to you. In my personal opinion, I would want to put a row right down the middle, but just remember, you have to operate in there. And so if you're going to be sitting there kind of doing this, it's not a very effective way to move within the crop. So having the ability to move around and work is pretty key. In general, I have relatively low pest pressure, but that's going to depend on you. Do you have a giant field of alfalfa right outside where your fan turns on and it just sucks bugs into your greenhouse? Or are you in the middle of the desert where there's just scrub and like bugs can't live out there? So your pest pressure will be almost site dependent in some cases. Or if you bring in dirty plants to your greenhouse and bugs are riding in on them, you inoculated yourself. You can always spray. There's lots of chemicals that you can use. There's also insects that you can use. So you can do the bug wars thing. So I can release, beneficial wasps and stuff like that in the greenhouse, but it's a little bit pricey over time. So you need to really consider that one. The 2 biggest pieces of advice I can give you: put insect screen on any opening, and then don't give pores. Anytime you bring someone in, that stuff on their shoes that came in, there's a white fly underneath their collar, and it only takes one. It only took one person to sneeze on you to get COVID. It only takes one white fly to sit there and take you out. Okay.
Question.
Yes.
Spray for spider mites.
Chemicals.
Which one?
I don't want to give that answer because I'm not a pesticide. I don't have a PAL. I can sidebar it with you for government purposes. Yes.
about 20 minutes, but really quick, we do have like some questions stacking up
Okay.
that go all the way back to the CO2 to the strawberries. So we kind of have the same. So I can give you the questions and you can kind of figure out when you want to answer them, or I have to take a call in about 5 minutes, so I can't ask them. So what would be your preference?
Want to give me a couple of them right now?
Okay.
We're going to take a couple questions right now.
Okay, so a couple questions. One was we got into kind of like an interesting discussion about using a brewery and a greenhouse at the same time to get carbon dioxide to the plants
Great idea.
as far as the feasibility.
Yep.
Then there was another question about fertilizers becoming hard to get.
That is a real problem.
How is that addressed? Then there was a question on, is it possible to grow crops of wheat or alfalfa and hydroponics? Do you grow the seed and then transplant in the field? Or is hay a traditional soil crop?
Yes.
And then the last question is, what is the best tasting strawberry plant?
Taste is a hard, we'll go backwards. Taste is a hard one to quantify. Everyone here has different tastes. And so, unfortunately, it's not just about sugar content. There's perfumery that goes on with strawberries. So that's why you do a variety trial. There's 1,000 different varieties out there. So I really can't narrow that one down. The next quick and dirty is the brewery combination. That's a great idea. If you can get some free CO2 in there and combine it, the brewery's happy because they've got some green washing that they can do on their operation. So I would highly encourage that one. As far as alfalfa and hay in the greenhouse, you tell me what plant you want to grow and I will grow it for you in the greenhouse. That is not the problem. It's the question of whether it is economically feasible, and you will never make it work out for you inside a greenhouse growing alfalfa or hay or some of these other type of crops. So if you want to do it for hobby purposes, or if you want to do fodder crops or something like that, that's one thing, but I would not count on. I have 10 goats. I will not grow their alfalfa in my greenhouse. It's just not going to work out. It's actually still cheaper for me to pay $26 a bale for alfalfa than it is to grow it in my greenhouse. So don't do that. I'm going to keep trucking here because I've got an eternity of things to discuss with you before I leave. This is 2 talks smashed into one, and I'm heavily caffeinated. The important thing to look at in this graph here is this is the salt content that I'm applying. Salt is just a general term for the fertilizers that we're using. The important thing to note is how it travels up over time as we get towards the right of each of these graphs. And what that means is that the salt content has been building up over time, and I have to remove the salt from the substrate. And so what that means is additional irrigation. The challenge is that I didn't notice this absent of having a sensor. The strawberries didn't show it. The strawberries still tasted great. The leaves looked mostly good. But the problem is that with specifically strawberries, it's a delayed reaction. I'm sick. Well, it could take me 2 weeks for me to sit there and start coughing or having a fever. The same thing's going to happen with the plant. It's a delayed reaction sometimes. And so that's where this sensor feedback helps a lot, is that it will tell you things that you can't perceive on your own when just looking at the plant. So just know that over time, you have to pay attention to your drainage and how the salt builds up. And the same thing within a field. You see salt crust showing in fields that have been heavily irrigated over time. You have to sit there and reach out the salts. Same thing is going to apply in this crop here. These are some photographs of things that go wrong in strawberries. It's not always honky-dory. These are some things that happen. I can get fruit rotting because it's sat on a wet surface. I could have something burrow into it. I could have just weird blemishes on the top, which make the strawberry not look as appealing, even though it tastes delicious. It's just got some weird, skin condition going on. I can get small ones, large ones, uneven ones. So there's things that can go wrong within strawberries. Most of it's within your control, but you need to factor in that you will have stuff that's not marketable, or it's going to be second rate or third rate, which is a business opportunity for you. You need to go find a person who makes jam, or you need to find a person who's going to make jelly or something like that. Going back to some graphs, another important thing to think about is that with strawberries, it's in flushes. Unless you do your crop production right, if you just have one crop and leave it in there for a period of time, it's going to go through cycles, and that's what you see here. And so initially, I get a good amount of production up until about the middle of March, and then you see dips. That's the plant going through phases, and so you have to accommodate for that. So you might want to have two crops going at the same time so that you can effectively ride the crop. So when one goes out, I've got another one coming in, and you kind of do the sine wave thing. But this is important to think. It's not just like tomatoes where I get production for 9 months. It's going to have some recovery time about it. And typically it's a month on, a month off, a month on, a month off. And you're still going to get production during the trough, just not as much. Okay. This is the layout of it. And so we had everything about 100 centimeters, 3 feet apart, off center. I could obviously space it closer together because there's a lot of room within there. Plants will eventually grow out in the next couple months, and you see that you don't have as much room as you initially thought. At this point, you're sitting there saying, man, I paid a lot of money for my greenhouse. This is breaking my heart. Give it some time and be patient, because you'll find very quickly you can't move around in there. Again, just a look a couple months later, you can see that it's really filled in. And so I really don't have as much walking room as I originally did in that previous picture. So that's just something to consider. If I double up on my plants, though, I can get a lot more production. And so I don't know, how valuable is it to sit there and kind of scrunch up and move in if you can get an extra couple kilograms of fruit? That's a you question. The big thing to remember is that when you have these large gaps, it defeats the purpose of a greenhouse. You'll have these weird zones of different environmental conditions, which are not conducive to the growing. You want to have a nice uniform condition throughout the greenhouse, and it helps by filling up the greenhouse to achieve that. As far as capital costs, I'm not an accountant or CPA, but what you all should know is that the IRS regulates a lot of the equipment when you go to do your taxes, and this is in terms of depreciation. So just know that there is this thing called the Farmer's Tax Guide, which the IRS puts out for your benefit, of course. And it's going to talk about things like horticultural structures. They have 10 to 15-year lifespans. And so that's going to be an accountant problem for you guys. But when the accountant sits there and goes, how do I depreciate your greenhouse? You sit there and say, hey, here's a farmer's guide. Help me figure this out. But just know that the IRS is watching us. One thing to think about too is that I'm going to show you some fairly steep numbers, and you're going to sit there and kind of gasp a little bit. But remember, a lot of the times, like what Russ talked about, you're taking out a loan and expensing stuff over a longer period of time. So the payback isn't the first month. You don't have to pay back all 10, 50,000, whatever thousands of dollars that first period. You've got several years to do it. So remember that you're amortizing over time. These are some examples of some capital costs. If I was to do a 10,000 square foot, relatively low tech, medium tech type greenhouse in Tucson, everything's very relative. Yeah.
Can we close those dreams? 'Cause it's-
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah,
So they're on half the screen.
there we go.
Thank you.
Get intimate. These are examples. So you're going to have to sit there and buy stuff, right? You have to buy your first set of fertilizers. You're going to have to buy tools, the equipment, the greenhouse, the growing system, the bees. Bees do a lot of stuff for you. You're going to want a storage cooler to keep your beautiful fruit in so that it doesn't go bad, or you don't have to sell it that first day. That stuff in this case was costing us just under $40,000, or about $4 a square foot. It's okay. Now, the greenhouse itself in this case was about $12 a square foot. So I'm upwards of somewhere around $15 a square foot. If we throw in pandemic pricing, it's probably about $20. And that's about on par with what you could expect for a reasonable greenhouse. In total, I'm expecting to spend about $150,000 to get my 10,000 square foot greenhouse going. That I think is probably a little bit low, especially right now, because prices of everything are just skyrocketing. You're going to need labor. This happened to be my old team, but you're going to have skilled labor and unskilled labor. You're going to have unskilled people, meaning that they're doing things like seeding and harvesting and stuff that doesn't really require, I don't want to say brain power, but it's just, you don't necessarily need to be heavily trained to do these types of activities in crop production. Whereas the manager is going to sit there who has to make a decision. That person needs to be paid a higher amount of money. These are some of the activities that I would have all of my labor doing. There's going to be more activities in there. Just as an idea of some labor references, if I just said, hey, at $12 an hour, which is a little bit low nowadays, I'm expecting to spend probably $15,000 to take care of that small greenhouse that I showed you, that 1,000 square foot one. So paying about, I don't know, $15 a square foot or something like that for my labor. Labor and electricity are typically the most expensive things. Utilities are the most expensive things within controlled environment crop production or just general agriculture. You can do things like predict your heating estimate. There's a program called Virtual Grower put out by the USDA. This will help you estimate the heating cost that you guys have. I was trying to pull up one of these for Snowflake, but I was having some technical difficulties last night. But the graph will look sort of similar for Snowflake as it does to Tucson. And you're going to see that in the wintertime on day 0, this is Julian days, I'm in the middle of winter. So my heating costs are going to be very high, and then it hits the summer, and then it dips down, and then it goes right back up. And so this will help you plan on periods of the year when you can expect really high bills. You can prepare for that. It's nothing's worse than getting a high utility bill than when you weren't expecting it and you don't have the cash to support it. Variable cost per plant. That's going to be things like the labor, the utilities, the seeds, the fertilizers, pots. These are all things that depend on your production level. How many units am I trying to produce? That's going to dictate how many seeds I have to buy. And you're generally going to have some sort of buffer and overage to that. Yeah. Labor, electricity, and your loan. Those are going to be the 3 highest ones that we predict. For sure, it's going to be labor and electricity. Especially labor. Labor costs are just going through the roof right now, as we all know. It's not a plant for beginners. So if you're nervous about crop production and you're not confident in yourself, start with lettuce, start with cucumbers, start with something small like that, and then move your way into strawberries, because there's a lot of things that can go wrong with strawberries. Tomatoes and strawberries are typically going to take you 3 months from the day that I start until the day I see a strawberry or a tomato. There's 3 months. That's a lot of time for stuff to go wrong. And I've got that kind of luck where stuff will go wrong at like 2 months and 3 weeks or something like that. So I've done beautiful the whole way. And then that last week, something happens. That really does happen to people. So the length of time for you to get to your crop, that can be widely different. Go back and read that. I want to get through some slides. This was an example of just me growing lettuce out of a 2,000 square foot greenhouse. I was selling at farmers markets, to restaurants, and to, just regular old folks. Some days I did not so good. Some days I did really good. It depends on the market, how much you're charging, what the product is. So on the downside, I can make as low as $9,000 or $10,000 per year. But on the upside, I can make $40,000 or $50,000 a year from one employee just doing all this kind of stuff. And again, this is highly market dependent, so don't count on this. One thing to realize is that 75% of what I grew actually went to sales. A portion of it was lost just to bad crops. Some of it I dropped. Some of it, went to the hungry people. And then some of it just I ate. So just be prepared that you're not going to sell 100% of what you grow. How do I establish what I'm going to grow? Well, go find a price list from your distributors or something like that so you can understand the prices that the restaurants are paying for the products that come off the Cisco truck. Iceberg lettuce in this case, 80 cents a piece. I'm not growing iceberg lettuce in my $150,000 greenhouse. I want something higher value. So I start scanning down and go, wow, 12 count of butter lettuce at 29 bucks a case. That's like $2.50 a head. I'm going to try growing some of that because I know I can make some money on that. Bull's blood, 8 ounces, that's $50 a pound. Oh my God, 50 bucks a pound. The problem is people are buying an ounce or half an ounce. And this is like the little sprigs of stuff that you see on the top of your frou-frou salad at the fancy restaurants. They're not just piling it on there, right? So get a hold of that. I don't know what you have to do to get the price list, but if you can get the price list, that helps me decide which crops I want to grow and potential customers I'm going to sell it to. These are a ton of crops that I've grown using hydroponic methods. So I've grown flowers, I've grown transplants, I've done herbs. So you have lots of different options. Growing the plant's the easy part. Turning the plant into a dollar is the hard part, okay? This is what the greenhouse looked like when I was doing tobacco. This is a floating hydroponic system. The blue stuff is Miracle Grow. Worked just fine. I didn't do any custom blends, nothing like that. I took Miracle Grow, dumped it in the water at the rate for tobacco transplants. I then later converted the tanks to grow lettuce. So I used the same equipment to do lots of diversely different crops, right? Now I'm just getting kind of arrogant. I use Google Maps or whatever your favorite mapping software is to define where my locations are that I'm selling to, so that I can come up with a mileage and a distance I traveled, so that I can sit there and make that cost part of my selling price. It costs me 28 cents per head on average to service all my farmers market locations. That was then built into my pricing of $2.50 per head. Because again, your transportation cost is your gas, your mileage on the truck or your vehicle, plus your time. There's a lot of risks out there. Say regulations and certifications and the fertilizer challenges are some of the big ones. One question that came in was, it's challenging to get fertilizers. Yeah, because we've had events like people trying to blow up buildings and do really stupid, awful stuff. Well, once they started doing things like the Timothy McVeigh building, they said, hey, don't buy ammonium nitrate anymore. We're not going to sell that to you. So for whatever you do, don't ask for ammonium nitrate. They'll put you on a list, I promise you. But the same thing's now happening to potassium nitrate, because that again is one of these oxidizer type chemicals, which can be used for nefarious purposes. And so when you buy it, you have to fill out a lot of forms. There's a lot of hazardous material fees. And so if you can find a place like Nutrien, which is a company that sells it in 50-pound bags locally, that's the best bet. Buy it in bulk. Air freight is really, really expensive for some of these chemicals, because again, you're shipping 50, 100 pounds at a time. Don't forget the customer. The customer's willingness to pay and ability to pay are two really important things. They might have the ability to pay, but it's like, I'm not paying for that crap. Or they sit there and they can't afford it. Like you're sitting there selling $5 lettuce in the middle of, South Tucson or something like that. That's probably not the right environment for that. And of course, the pandemic. So there's a couple different ways to plan for this. How much am I trying to grow, or what is the scenario that I'm stuck with that I need to make work? So you have to analyze that yourself. How much do I want to make or grow, or what am I playing with currently? And that's two ways to sit there and think about that. And you could be limited by the site. I mean, that happens often. I don't have a big enough site. I'm on a hill. The water is not very good. I'm too far from my market, whatever. So do you want to be large or small? That's up to you. I would start small. No one in here is going to be the next Facebook of agriculture in the next month or two. So just start small, grow, right? How do you want to sell? Do you want to do it directly to customers? Do you want to sit there and wholesale it, retail it, do it CSA? There's lots of different methods to get rid of your crops to the general public. Large and small customers, you know who your large and small customers are out here. Each one's going to have different requirements. If I'm trying to sell to Safeway, they might have a really high insurance requirement for me. In fact, I know they do. If I want to sell to Walmart, I have to give up my first child and probably like 9 out of 10 of my goats. If I'm dealing with smaller folks, there's a lot less risk. Okay. Go back and read that. But these are some of the problems. The biggest one is they're very sensitive to issues. So if you're not consistent, they will drop you as a customer like white on rice, man. So beware of that. And then, of course, the insurances. The insurances are challenging because the insurance companies don't totally understand what we're doing. So when you go for CEA crop insurance, there's not as many companies that deal with that. And you're going to need food safety riders and stuff like that. I'm going to pass over this for the sake of time, but just things to think about with the small customers. The small customers where you want to start off with, because they're the most forgiving. Oh, I'm sorry, there's a blemish on here. That's okay, I don't mind too much. There's a ladybug on there. That's okay, I don't mind. Ladybugs are cool. Walmart will not deal with that. They will sit there and eject you. You hear people, oh, wow, can you grow chocolate basil? Well, yeah, sure I can. Are you going to pay for it? That's the biggest problem. I grew lots of specialty crops. I was ready. I go back to the customer who requested it, and they say, by the way, that'll be $10 a pound. They're like, well, wait, I can get basil for $4. And you're like, that's apples to automobiles. This is specialty chocolate basil. You're talking about stuff that came out of Mexico. Basil's basil. And you're like, well, man, I wish I had known that for the last 3 months. So is a really bad way to think about things unless you are very sure of yourself. So make sure you have a contract or some guarantee from your customer that they're going to purchase what you do. Farmers markets are a great way to start off. In general, they're pretty forgiving for you, and that's where you get the most exposure to customers that are either going to be long-term or potential ones. Wholesale versus retail. If you want to wholesale it, that's the fastest, quickest, dirtiest sale you can possibly get. I'm in, I'm out. I sold my product. I took a lower price, but I'm done. I get to go back to sleep on Saturday morning. As opposed to retail, where I might sit there and sit at a farmer's market, I get to have fun and meet people and get responses, but that's my time on a Saturday morning. I'm spending no less than 5 to 6 hours at the market, setting up, taking down. And then you sometimes have to do a lot of salesmanship, which, if you can imagine, I'm probably not the best salesman in the room. So there's something to think about. The problem being then, what happens if the money that you get from wholesale or the money you get from retail is identical? What's the value of your time? What's the value of the intelligence that you get from meeting people and hearing about what they like or dislike, or the customer introductions? So there's instances where your money might be equivalent to each other in both scenarios, and then you have intangibles that you have to think about, which I can't answer for you. I think it's important to think about the community, so it would be good for you guys to sit there and team up with a food bank. They're a great way to sit there and get rid of your second-rate and third-rate stuff that's totally edible, but Walmart doesn't want to buy it, or the customers at the farmers market don't want to buy it. So do something nice for your community. Reflections with Miles. This was me at the farmers market with my buddy here. He's about 6'5", so Beavis and Lurch over here are probably not the two best salesmen to have. You might want to break it up a little bit with some girls, or someone who's less threatening looking than these two schmucks. You don't want to buy vegetables from these two. So in some cases, people don't show up. So call your friends, bring them over, make it look like it's a little bit more busy than it actually is. Get some softer looking individuals than these two grifty looking people. Again, you're selling a story. In a lot of cases, this is now going to become a family farm. So you can get away with things like crayons and markers and all these kind of little signs. And it's important advertisement. My stuff is pesticide free. It was grown less than a mile away. I harvested it today. This is the person that grew it for you, right? So these are all marketing tactics that I can sit there and put in. You can sit there and model a lot of stuff and come up with spacing. There's a lot of neat software out there, but again, it really gets down to you in the greenhouse and operating, because I can find some people that will make this work down to the centimeter, but in actual life, sometimes spacing doesn't work the way they model it. So just be aware of that. I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about, I'm running low on time.
So, if you want to wrap up in about 3 or 4 minutes.
Yeah, I can do that. I'm from LA, so I'm going to really talk fast now. You are going to be subject to food safety. This is a real big food safety thing. You've heard about recalls, at least in the last year. This is stuff that comes out of greenhouse. They had a major one that happened recently. Wash your hands. Wash your hands, please. That's the biggest one they tell us to avoid pandemic problems. Same thing's going to happen in crop production. So wash, wash, wash. You're protecting yourself against all the nasties like E. coli and salmonella. Those are generally the two biggest ones that we're worried about. And it comes from fecal matter and stuff like that that's associated with humans and animals. My buddy Skeeter there, he's one of the subjects that sits there and does that kind of stuff. Of course, if you have dirty conditions, you could have mold and stuff like that that gets into your crop that's equally bad and can cause recalls. So food safety is a really big thing. You're going to come up with a food safety plan. There's a program offered by the state of Arizona called GIPGAP, GHTGAP, Good Handling Practices, Good Agricultural Practices. It's a training program. It takes approximately 2 days. It's a food safety program. And basically the name of the game is CYA, cover your ass. And this is going to be something that you do to help with your insurances, to help with recalls in the future. Uh-oh, I got sick. Not from my operation. I've got a food safety plan in place, and look at all my fancy records that help me prove my case. Because remember, you're guilty until proven innocent. There's standards that we are going to be subject to that are going to be both public and private. Public being USDA, AZDA, stuff like that, your local county, town, whatever. And then there's going to be private ones like the associations, which you may be subject to if you happen to be a larger grower. That's generally not us. You might have to get a private industry certification if you want to deal with the big guys like Walmart or Costco. And so the way to think about that is like UL listed, the little UL thing you see on the bottom of electronics. It's kind of what these people do. They test your product to make sure it's safe to go out to the customers, and they give you a fancy little stamp and a piece of paper that certifies that you're a good grower. There's something called FSMA, the Food Safety Modernization Act, which will apply to all of us, I believe, at some point. Again, this will be covered in your GIP-GAP presentation, which I encourage every one of you to go to if you're thinking about getting into food production. There's a lot of it. Know that not all crops can be stored at the same conditions. So there's going to be tables out there like this one that sit there and dictate, hey, this thing gets stored at this temperature, this thing gets stored at this temperature, this one at this humidity, this one at that humidity. So if you grow different stuff, you might have to have different coolers to handle your different crops. So just be aware of that, but that's a table out there. As far as food safety methods, gloves, hairnets, coats, beard nets, take off the jewelry, no bling. Don't wear fake nails, no nail polish. I learned that one from the county food safety people. And then just some other crops, I grew green onions for a while, scallions. This is about a 60-day crop that you're looking at here, floating on water using the same nutrient solutions. So the same materials all across the board to grow different types of crops. That's an Arizona problem. We have scorpions. This is an Arizona solution. You catch the scorpion, you turn it into your slave. Just thanking some professors who, if you like anything I talked about in terms of strawberry and crop production, here are 2 individuals that helped me learn it. So give them the credit, not me. And that was a cantaloupe that I grew instead of a tomato inside the greenhouse. So you could grow melons inside your greenhouse. I know it looks like I might have smoked that melon, but I did not. That was not some sort of smoking device. And here's some references. I think I made it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And the only question I had come through was, is it a seller's market or a buyer's market right now? I did answer that it depends on where you are in the time of year. And so is there anything else you wanted to?
I think it's going to be crop dependent, and I think it's definitely location dependent. The example I can give is a client of mine. He lives in Monterey. I just went down there about 2 months ago. He tells me that he sells his little strawberries in a basket for $10, but he does that in Carmel, where Clint Eastwood's the mayor, right? If he went 45 minutes south, he would never get more than $5. And then when you ask the grower himself, he's like, I'd never pay more than $5. And it's just like, oh, okay, great. The absolute extreme is in New York City. There's an indoor strawberry factory. This guy sells eight strawberries for $50. And there's nothing extraordinary about them that would warrant $50, except that it's probably in New York City. So again, it's highly dependent on the location and the crop. What else?
So we go ahead and go to